Fort McHenry is a national monument and public park in Baltimore, Maryland. There's free parking on site and to the grounds. It's very well upkept. They have some monuments, some statues, cherry trees. The birds like to gather there, the geese, the ducks, and there's good views of the inner harbor. It's very well upkept, but it is pretty popular, so there's a lot of people wandering around. Also on site is the museum. You can enter, pay a $15 fee, and then tour the museum, some of the artifacts they have, and that gains you access to the Star Fort. In the Star Fort, they have some of the original buildings inside. You can enter the buildings, take a look at the informational posters that they have, and also the replicas of what it would have been like at that time. Outside the Star Fort, they have the artillery for anti-ship use and anti-city use, which we'll get into a little bit later. Overall, it's a very nice place. The fee goes towards maintaining the fort, maintaining the grounds, and further research on the subject, but they don't actually check to see if you paid it or not, so I'm not your mom, I'm not a cop, do what you want. I recommend it if you're visiting and you want a little piece of history in a very clean, nice setting, but it's nothing spectacular. It is a nice park, though. Now, I'm going to get into how the fort evolved over time, how it changed. It's a living being. It's not stagnant. It's gone through several wars, even though it was only active in one, and for each war, it served its own purpose, and the fort changed to fit that. Only fairly recently, in the last 100 years or so, has it changed to what you see today. After the birth of the nation, a series of forts were commissioned for coastal defense. Fort McHenry was completed in the early 1800s and was a star-shaped fort designed to provide protection to the Baltimore harbor. The star-shaped design means that any incoming military that tried to take the fort would have to either enter through the guard barracks along two completely exposed bridges, and then they'd have to break through the wooden door into the barracks itself, where they would be completely exposed to gunfire the whole way there, or they would have to try to scale the 8-foot walls on the outside of the fort, and due to its star-shaped design, they would be completely exposed on two sides. So it was very effective for a small group of defenders to protect the fort against a large incoming military force. However, because of size limitations of star-shaped forts, most of the long-range artillery was outside. But because of its location in the harbor, this means that they would be able to fire at ships that were a mile away before ever reaching land, so they had that time to man those long-range artillery, and then if the enemy got too close, they could retreat back into the fort itself and hold out for quite some time, with the cannons mounted on each end of that star. By the long-range artillery, they had small supplies of powder and shot, and in the fort itself they had more, and also ammunition for muskets, a few barracks, and some food supplies. Outside the fort, they had a couple of barracks for regular use, a hospital, and just outside the official line was a bar, damn near a requirement for forts at the time and present day. Due to its position in the harbor downstream of the Baltimore hub, it provided excellent defense for the coastal city. It had a range of about 1.5 miles and could protect the city against any incoming threats. During the battle against the British, the Americans had regular naval cannons, smoothbore, with an effective range of about 1.5 miles. But the British had rockets, which were inaccurate but had a range of 1.75 miles, and mortars with a range of 2 miles. The British needed the Navy to enter the harbor so that they could provide support for the military, for the army portion of the military, that was moving north on the land. And the star-shaped fort was something that they had to take care of. They had to break the fort so that they could enter the harbor and provide that support. So they sat outside of the fort's 1.5 mile range as they tried to shell it to break the defenders to get them to leave. However, the defenders stayed put. So it was an American victory, but due to the ranges involved and the 25-hour bombardment time, only 4 people died with 15 injured. But it was a victory, and America needed heroes at that time. After the War of 1812, a series of improvements were made to Fort Henry. They got a shipment of Columbade cannons, which were just larger coastal defense cannons capable of larger ranges and larger rounds. They also saw the construction of bomb shelters in the guard shack. On either side, between the 2 doors, once you enter, there are these small rooms you can go into with air holes coming in that can hold about 100 or 200 people to protect them from shelling, because they did not want a repeat of that 25-hour bombardment without somewhere the people could go. They also saw the construction of several new buildings on the fields, because in the Civil War, the fort's primary purpose was a prisoner of war camp. But because of the situation going on in that country at the time, and especially in Maryland, it wasn't just POWs at this camp. There were a lot of political prisoners too. People who wrote in newspapers saying that the invasion of the South was a bad thing. People with secessionist views, just civilians who didn't say the right things, stuff like that. All these people were imprisoned at Fort McHenry. Also at Fort McHenry was a mortar or two, which were aimed at the city of Baltimore. And some of the civilians in the city were actually invited onto the fort to look at the mortar and to look at the cannons, and they were told that they were pointed at the city so that if the city decided to join the South and try to secede, they were under orders to destroy the city. Now, you can argue whether or not that was the right thing to do. I honestly don't really care, but it is an interesting point in history, and it's interesting that's not talked about a whole lot, but it was a fort that served many purposes over its lifespan, and that's a pretty cool one. After the Civil War, they upgraded their Columbade guns to Rodman guns. Very similar design, but the Rodman gun's forging process was different. It included a hollow piece of metal that was inserted into the mold, and then the iron was poured around it. There was a fire on the outside of the mold, and water was pumped through the hollow metal pipe on the inside of the mold so that it would cool from the inside out as opposed from the outside in solid cast iron construction. The problem with cooling from the outside in the natural process is as iron cools, it contracts. So the most outside layer cools first, it contracts, and then inside that layer cools and contracts, and those opposing forces creates a tension stress. And that tension stress, it will leave some gaps in the metal, some air pockets, some hollow pockets, and it will also leave cracks in the metal, because metal isn't that great at tension forces, but it's very good with compression forces. So if you cool it from the inside out, you have the most inner layer cool first and contract, and then the layer outside of that cools and contracts. And that way, it's not tension forces, it's compression forces, and all the metal is compressing on itself. And metal has very good properties for compression forces. So by doing it this way, you can you can have more energy firing from inside the barrel for the same weight and the same design of gun. So these guns were capable of larger rounds going longer distances without the high risk of damage to the gun itself. These were installed after the Civil War period. I think it was 1866, and those are the guns that are on the field now. So when you go to visit the fort, the Star Fort mostly hasn't changed. Some of the buildings, they added another level around the Civil War period. But the outside, the cannon defense here, ship defense, the artillery, those are all Rodman guns. Those weren't there during the War of 1812, but they are very cool guns, so I know why they left them there. The fort didn't see any changes during the Mexican-American War, but they did see changes during the Spanish-American War, because at that time they found out that the city had grown to the point where Fort McHenry was no longer capable of defending the city against an attack, and that's when Fort Armistead was created, which sat further downstream so it can protect the inlet to the entire city of Baltimore. Now I have another video on that fort as well, but just a short summary of it. It had better guns in it, fewer of them, but better guns. It was in a very good position, and it never saw any combat. During World War I, the fort didn't see any use as a defense battery, but it changed drastically. The entire island there was filled with hospital buildings. It became one of the nation's largest military hospitals and saw the treatment of many troops coming back injured from France. After World War I, that all died down. A lot of the buildings were removed. In World War II, it saw use as a Coast Guard base, which, because it's the Coast Guard, we know almost nothing about it because nobody pays attention to what those squirrely little fucks do. But of the pictures that I saw, they used it to train on rowboats and march around the field. So it looks like they didn't build any new construction there. They just used it as a parade grounds, more or less. After World War II, it was handed over to the city, and it became a public park and a national monument at that time. But the city around it was still growing. And in the 1960s, they were looking at continuing a highway and building a bridge right across it because it really was the best option available as far as cost and time goes. However, this would put one of the bridge supports right in the parade grounds of Fort McHenry, and so there was public outcry about it. So the plans for a bridge were scrapped, and instead they went with what's in use today, the tunnel, which is very cool. It's 100 feet under the water, so large ships can still go through the bay, but it's not obscuring the skyline or anything like that. Which brings us up to modern day. In the 80s, there were some digs done on the site, which is how they found out that there was a bar on the field. That wasn't recorded anywhere. They also found evidence of earth movements to build up the walls and all of that. That, again, wasn't recorded anywhere. And even a defensive wall on the inside of the Star Fort, so that if enemies did breach through the guardhouse, they had another wall there where they can shoot down at them from cover. That's all really cool to me in that we actually need to perform digs to find out the history of the location that was built during the age of our nation. This was only a few hundred years ago. We were the United States of America, and we still had to do digs to find this stuff out. Very neat stuff. It's a pretty cool park overall. I recommend visiting it because most of it's free, and you get to look at some big old guns, and Star Forts are just really cool. There's some ammo depots out by the Rodman guns. The ammo depots were basically just underground bunkers with hard angled entrance points so that no munitions had a straight shot into them. Yeah, it's some pretty cool stuff, but if you're looking for that authentic, that military fort sort of a feel, this may not be it. Good park though.